So as I mentioned before, the secretary declared an emergency, and then FDA started requiring emergency use authorizations for both in vitro diagnostics for COVID and for LDTs. Initially, though, FDA, and this was the first EUA that FDA authorized, FDA authorized it for the CDC's test, and the idea was that CDC's test would be the only one that laboratories could use to test for COVID-19. CDC would ship the testing materials to qualified public health laboratories so that they could perform the assay. It soon became apparent that there was a problem with one of the controls, and the tests were not working properly. And so a delay in testing. Against this backdrop, FDA was offered help from laboratories. The Association of Public Health Laboratories sent a letter saying, please exercise enforcement discretion so that we can get involved in standing up LDTs for COVID. This was endorsed as well by the American Association of Clinical Chemistry. FDA said, no, thank you. And then FDA issued the first of many guidance documents outlining FDA's expectations for COVID-19 tests offered by clinical laboratories. Now, as I said before, FDA did not have to take this approach, and it's not an approach that was taken in all previous episodes of infectious disease, which thankfully did not become pandemics. FDA could have exercised enforcement discretion, but in this instance chose not to. So under the initial policy that FDA issued at the end of February 2020, high complexity clinical laboratories that were interested in providing COVID-19 testing were required to submit emergency use authorization applications to FDA. FDA said that they could develop and begin using these tests before receiving an EUA, that they were required to notify FDA when they began testing and to submit a completed EUA within 2 weeks of such notification. Laboratories offering serology tests needed to notify but not to submit an EUA. And FDA posted these notifications on its website. FDA amended this policy to provide an alternative path shortly thereafter, saying to states, if you want to take responsibility for COVID tests for labs in your jurisdiction, you're free to do so. 9 states took FDA up on that offer. So not a whole lot. Not much happened. Well, so labs started to submit EUAs and go through that process with varying success until on August 19th, 2020, HHS said, FDA, don't regulate LDTs. You may not regulate LDTs unless you go through what's called notice and comment rulemaking, which is an administrative law term that basically says federal agencies have to make public the process of making rules and get public comment for those rules before they do that. Now, this is something FDA has never done for LDTs, which has been a source of criticism by those who argue that since regulating LDTs is a substantive departure from what FDA has done historically, rulemaking is needed. FDA has always said rulemaking is not needed. In this case, HHS said rulemaking is needed, which essentially stopped FDA from regulating. And it was written broadly enough that while HHS's target clearly was COVID testing to relax requirements on laboratories seeking to offer COVID-19 LDTs, its policy covered all LDTs. HHS also in its announcement said any previous guidance on LDTs that had been issued by FDA are rescinded. They don't exist anymore. And along with this, this decision was supported by a legal memorandum that was sent to FDA by HHS's then general counsel, but was made public in Politico, questioning FDA's legal authority, or at least the breadth of FDA's claimed authority over LDTs generally. In response to that, FDA then said, well, we will no longer review any LDTs, EUAs for LDTs, even if laboratories want them. And by this point, a number of laboratories had them and wanted amendments to them, and it was unclear whether that would happen. And laboratories that didn't yet have them, also some wanted them because of the liability protections that come along with having emergency use authorizations that are provided under the statute, and for other reasons as well, no doubt. In response to that, HHS said, no, FDA, if laboratories want EUAs, you have to review them. So this was a very unusual public spat between HHS, which is the department that oversees FDA, and FDA, the agency that is supposed to, in some sense, take direction from HHS. It was unusual and not helpful to those trying to figure out what the rules were. So the upshot of that, though, was starting in August of 2020, laboratories could proceed and offer COVID tests without going through FDA, without getting an EUA if they wanted to do that, and many did. Until, this brings us up to the present date almost, November 15th, 2021, the new administration, there was an election in between there, as we all may recall, HHS rescinded its August 20th policy, saying we're withdrawing that policy that was established during the previous administration that limited FDA's ability to address certain problematic COVID-19 tests. By withdrawing the policy, HHS is helping to ensure that COVID-19 tests work as intended. Effective today, HHS no longer has a policy on LDTs that is separate from FDA's longstanding approach in this area. Now, that word problematic is interesting. FDA also has asserted or alluded to certain problems with LDTs for COVID-19 that FDA has observed, but has never really given details about what those problems have been, but has certainly justified the desire to regulate LDTs because of certain problematic LDTs it has observed. So along with HHS's announcement, hand in hand, FDA issued an updated policy outlining its expectations for laboratories that wanted to offer COVID LDTs. And the types of changes that were proposed or that were described in the November 15th guidance fall into two broad buckets: substantive changes to requirements and a change to FDA's prioritization of review, what EUAs FDA wanted to see and would weigh in on. FDA pointed out that the grant of an EUA is discretionary, so FDA doesn't have to review or come to a decision on any submission for an EUA. So turning to the substantive changes first, FDA said that laboratories that had been offering LDT serology tests based on the notification policy, as well as laboratories offering LDTs without an EUA based on the announcement by HHS in August 2020, would now need to submit an EUA within 60 calendar days, which turns out to be January 14th, so just passed, but could continue to offer their tests as long as they submitted an EUA within that time frame while the EUA was pending FDA review. Laboratories who did not submit within 60 days were expected to stop offering their testing. This policy was limited to LDTs certified as high complexity under CLIA, did not, for example, include home collection. And FDA said it would not authorize a test if the submission does not demonstrate that the test has been appropriately validated, including validation with clinical specimens using an appropriate comparator. If FDA denied the EUA, the laboratory would be expected to stop offering testing within 15 days. Now, for laboratories seeking to introduce new LDTs after November 15th, so those who had not yet been offering testing prior to November 15th, they would be required to submit an EUA request and wait for FDA authorization. In addition, the policy addressed laboratories that wanted to make modifications to EUA authorized molecular diagnostic IVDs or LDTs. And here again, there was a difference between changes that would be made after the policy was announced and changes that had already been made before the policy was announced. So turning to after, November 15th, certain types of modifications could be made without amending or submitting a new EUA, as long as there was no change to the indication for use, there was no change in the analyte-specific reagents that were being used, the laboratory validated the change and confirmed its equivalency to the authorized test it was being changed from. And again, the modified test was performed only in the CLIA certified high complexity lab that made the modification. If modifications had already been made before November 15th, laboratories could continue offering them as long as those modifications had been made in accordance with what had been FDA's policy on modifications. Now, turning to the second prong of the November 15th policy change, FDA's changes in prioritization. And as I said before, this affected both IVD manufacturers and laboratories. We're focusing today on the effect of laboratories. So for laboratories, the changes in prioritization were that FDA said it would be focusing on reviewing EUAs for molecular diagnostic LDTs that were highly sensitive, high throughput, intended for pooling, home collection, screening, or detection of multiple analytes, and focusing on serology LDTs intended for quantitative detection of neutralizing antibodies or intended for the quantitative measurement of antibody titers. For both types of tests, FDA expressed the desire that the submissions come from experienced developers with the ability to scale up manufacturing capacity. And FDA set a target of at least 500,000 tests per week within 3 months of getting an EUA.